Here. Hi, everybody. Good morning. We're going to start our session today. I'm sorry that I wasn't available on the session on Thursday. I've been trying to upload the recording onto the Google Drive. Any of you on the WhatsApp group, I messaged you this morning. Whoever hasn't given me their phone number isn't on the WhatsApp group. I hope you will give me your phone numbers and you can join. I've been having some issues uploading the recording from Thursday. It says that I have to wait another 5.5 years. I don't plan to wait that long to upload a recording, so I'll find another way to do that, and I'll get the recording to you. Today we have with us Nurit Gal. She's an energy expert here in Israel. She's going to talk to us about energy policy in Israel. Please think of any questions that you have, any examples from your own countries, and maybe we can share, hopefully we can share after Nurit's presentation. Take it away, Nurit. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to speak to such an international group. I hope it's not too cold in Russia. Well, it's really nice now. I'll start with a short presentation of myself. I was the former deputy to the chairman of the Electricity Authority in Israel for several years. And I also have a PhD in energy, focused on the effect of natural gas price uncertainty on investment in electricity sector. And currently
Nurit?
I'm a consultant with the, yes.
Sorry, if you could just take it a little bit slower just for the interpreters. Thank you.
Okay.
A little bit.
So I was saying that I'm a former deputy to the chairman of the Israeli Electricity. I am a consultant at the Israeli electricity sector, consultant to the private investors in the electricity sector. And what I will review today is the Israel's electricity policy, and actually a view of the Israeli electricity market. And this is the agenda for today. We will start with the electricity demand in Israel and explain why it is growing very rapidly. We will move on to discuss the market structure of Israel, and then we will review the fuel mix, the changing fuel mix of Israel and the emission targets. We will continue with renewables and storage. And finally, we will sum up with the emissions in Israel to review how the emissions are declining due to Israel's energy policy. Okay, let me know if this is slow enough for the interpretation. Okay, fine. So the first chapter in our discussion today is Israel electricity demand. What we see here is the consumption per capita in Israel and in the neighboring countries. So as you may know, Israel is in the Middle East, and the neighboring countries are Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Cyprus. And what you can see in this chart is that Israel demand per capita is much higher compared to its neighbors, okay? The reason for that is that Israel's economy is much more developed than the GDP in Israel is much higher, is more developed compared to the neighbors. And you see the difference here. The consumption in Israel is approximately 7,500 kilowatt hour per year per capita. Overall, Israel, which has a population of 10 million people approximately, is consuming 72 terawatt hour, and the peak demand in Israel is 14 gigawatt. So this is just to have an insight of what is the size of this electricity market and how different it is than the neighboring countries. If we take a view of the past, like the 10 years from 2006 to 2016, and here you see countries mainly in Europe, and you can see Israel in the red line, and the blue line represents the demand growth in different countries. I guess your country might be in the list too. And what you see here, that is in some countries, the demand is growing, and there are many countries where the demand is not growing at all or even declining. And you see that Israel is among the countries where the demand is growing. Over 10 years, the demand grew by 40%, which is a lot. Okay, other countries which has such a high growth are Turkey and Ireland. So Israel is a part of just a few groups with a very high demand growth. So you may want to know why the demand in Israel is growing so rapidly. Okay, there are several explanations. One of them is the GDP growth of Israel. The economy is growing, And you can see OECD countries, the GDP growth of OECD countries, this is the green line. And the GDP growth of Israel is the red line. And what you see is that over the period of since the year 2000, the GDP of Israel was growing much more rapidly compared to other European countries. And this explains some of the demand growth of the electricity in Israel. In addition to that, the population in Israel is growing. In some European countries, mainly in the eastern part of Europe, the demand is, the population is becoming smaller over time. People are immigrating, and there is a negative immigration. But in Israel, not only do we have positive immigration, we also have a high birth rate, and the population is growing by approximately 2% per year. And this also contributes to the high demand growth of the electricity. There are two other factors. One of them is the EV, the electric vehicle. So currently we don't have that many cars, electric cars, but the expectations are that the electric cars, the EV, will grow very rapidly in Israel, and this will contribute to high demand growth. There is an additional factor, and these are the Palestinians. There is a Palestinian community in Israel, which is very large, the community or the population in Gaza and in the West Bank. You can see it here. And Israel is the main supplier of electricity for these regions. In Gaza, we supply, I think, about 50% of the electricity. And in the West Bank, we supply 95% of the electricity. The demand per capita in this area is not very high, but it is growing in a more rapid rate compared to Israel, mainly because the economy is growing and because the population is growing in these areas. And as a result of that, this contributes to the overall demand growth of Israel. So this is the first point that I wanted to share with you, is that Israel is a Western country, but it is unlike other Western countries, we are experiencing a high demand growth. And this, of course, affect our policy, because a country with a high demand growth should take care, a very careful care of the supply, the security of the supply. It means that we need to build new power plant. It means that the use of fuels is growing over time. And it means that if we want to shift to renewables, then the amount of renewables will grow over time. Even just to stay at the same rate of renewables, we will have to make additional investment in renewables just to keep the same rate. And this is because the overall market is growing at a rapid rate. So this is our first point for today. The second point is related to the market structure. So as you may know, I guess you're all familiar with electricity sectors in other countries. So many countries reformed their electricity sector. They changed the structure of the sector. And the main change over all the world, almost really in most of the countries of the world, is that most countries, they started as a monopoly. The monopoly means that it was just one utility or more that control all the segments of the electricity sector. So usually the monopolies, they constructed the generation, the IPP, the power plant. They were the system operators. They built the grid, the transmission grid and the distribution grid, and they also took care of the retail, of the supply to the consumers. So usually it started all electricity markets with just one utility doing everything. And in most countries over the past, let's say 2 or 3 decades, these monopolies were disassembled or unbundled, and the segments were separated so that several companies are generating the electricity and different companies control the grid and the system operation. And in Israel, up until 2018, so just until 3 years ago, we had one utility because Israel is not that large, so it was just one utility for the whole country. And this utility, it's called IEC, Israel Electricity Corporation. It controls all the segments of the electricity sector. So it controlled the generation, system operation, grid, and supply to the consumers. And just in 2018, the government managed to overcome the labor union of this ISC, of this utility, and an agreement was achieved. And the market was disassembled or unbundled. So currently, there is a program, and it is going on very well, to have an independent system operator in Israel. And it's an independent, governmentally owned company. And it just started to function just really a couple of weeks ago. Our independent system operator started to work. I see this utility will continue to control the grid. They will build and operate the transmission grid. They will continue to do that. But in the generation segment and in the retail segments, Israel is going towards competition. So currently there is a privatization of the power plant, and three power plants were already sold to private entities, and two other large sites of electricity generation, they will also be privatized in the next few years. So the share of the private sector will increase dramatically, and Israel will have competition in the generation segment. And in the retail segment, Israel is also going towards competition. This is starting at a low rate. So currently there is a very small competition at the retail segment, and it's mainly competition for consumers which are large commercial or industrial consumers. And the retail part, the retail consumers are the residential consumers are not part of the competition yet. But the program or the policy of the government is that each of us as a household, we will be able to choose our retailer for electricity. So there will be also competition in the retail segment. So Israel is a latecomer to this unbundling, to this reform. But finally, after a very, very long process that took like 20 years to manage, finally, since 2018, the electricity sector in Israel is unbundled, and we are going towards competition. Here you can see the share of the private sector and the share of the utility, the share of IC. So currently, last year to 2020, after the privatization of some of the power plant, so the private sector owned 1/3, 36% of the generation capacity of Israel. And the utility, IEC, Israel Electricity Corporation, they own 64%. And in the future, IEC will own 40%, and this will happen in just several years, 4 years, and the private sector will own almost 60% of the generation capacity of Israel. So IEC will continue to own, they will own some of the generation segment. It would be better if they did not own any generation at all, and they will only own the grid. But this was impossible to achieve in the discussion of the reform. So their market share will decrease to 40%, and Israel will have a nice competition with 60% private sector ownership. Okay, so this was our second part related to the electricity sector structure. Our third part of this presentation is the fuel mix and the emission targets of Israel. So like many countries, Israel committed to emission reductions. We did that in the first time in 2015 for the Paris Accord. And again, we did it last July for this meeting in Glasgow. And Israel committed that until 2030, we will reduce the emission by 27%. When looking at the numbers, so Israel in 2016, we emitted 79 million tons of carbon, and we will emit by 2030 only 58 million tons. So this is a reduction of 27%. And some people who view these numbers, they may say that this is not a very high commitment. So only 27%, it's not high compared to the commitment of other countries by this year, by 2030. But here you have to recall that Israel demand and Israel's population is growing. So when you have a population that is growing and a demand that is continuously growing, it's very challenging to reduce the emissions. And therefore, for Israel, emission reduction of 27% is very challenging because the demand continues to grow, because we would have, without the steps that I will describe, our emission would have grown even larger than the emissions of 2016. So for Israel, it is challenging to reduce by 27%. The commitment for the long term, for 2050, is an 85 emission reduction. And this is, of course, like many other countries, this is a very challenging target. Now we're taking a look at the fuel mix of Israel. So what we see in this chart, at the x-axis, we see the years from 2010 to 2020, and the future estimates for 2025. And what we see in the y-axis is the overall consumption of electricity. And the numbers, each column, they describe how much of the electricity was consumed from each type of fuel. So let's start by looking at the year 2010. In 2010, Israel consumed 60% of the generation by coal. Coal, of course, is very dirty, and emissions are very high. But only just 10 years ago, 60% of Israel's generation was provided by coal. This coal was not generated in Israel. We, of course, imported the coal. Israel does not have its own coal. It was imported from all over the world, and it provided 60% of the generation in Israel. 40% was generated by natural gas. And you can see that in 2011, the numbers are pretty similar. There's not much change. And then there is a major change in 2012. You see that the generation from coal is even increased, and the amount of generation from natural gas decreased, and we started using diesel, which is of course even more dirty than using coal. So there is a large drop of the use of natural gas of Israel in 2012. The reason for that is that in these years, Israel was not using natural resources, its own resources of natural gas. In these years, we had a very tiny reservoir, only 4 BCM, which is almost nothing. It was called Maribi. And most of the natural gas of Israel in this year, it was coming from Egypt. Israel was importing natural gas from Egypt. And what happened is that in this year, in 2012, the pipelines that we used to import the natural gas from Egypt, they were continuously exploded due to terrorist attacks. And after several such explosions, Egypt decided that they will no longer export natural gas to Israel. So Israel had a major energy crisis because we were becoming dependent on the use of natural gas, but the natural gas all of a sudden became unavailable for Israel. So we had a very high crisis, and we started using diesel, which is not only dirty, it's also very expensive. So the cost of electricity, it really spiked in this year. Luckily enough, in this time, especially in this year, Israel started the operation of new self-owned natural gas reservoir. 2 large reservoirs were discovered in the Mediterranean. We can see this in the next slide, I think. So this is the map of Israel, and this is the Mediterranean. And you can see the natural gas reservoirs in the Mediterranean. So the main reservoirs, one of them is called Tamar. This is the first reservoir that was developed. And in Tamar, there is approximately 300 BCM. And the second one that was discovered is the Leviathan. This is a much larger reservoir. It contains 600 BCM, which is very high compared to the use of Israel. Israel currently today consumes 10 BCM per year, and it is expected to increase. So having a reservoir of 600 BCM, when the country consumes only 10 BCM per year, of course, this provides a very good security of supply. So first, Tamar was developed, and Leviathan was developed later. It started operations only last year, actually 2 years ago. And this solved the problem, the crisis of Israel. So if we go back to this chart, you see that in 2012, we had a major problem and we were using high share of diesel because we had no natural gas. But a year later, in 2013, the operation of Tamar, the first reservoir, began. And then we moved back to using natural gas. And since this year, since 2013, the policy of Israel is to decline in a very significant way the use of coal. And you can see the decline. You can see that the amount that is generated by coal is declining each year. We did that by several steps. This was the policy of the Minister of Energy. He decided, for example, that the coal will be used only at the minimal load of the power plant. So if there is a 1 unit of generation of coal and it can generate 600 megawatt, So the minister said you can only use 300 megawatts. The coal plant will work at a minimal level, at a minimal load, because he wanted to decrease the use of coal to decrease the emissions. And these steps were implemented, and you can see the decline over the years, and you can see how in the year 2020, the use of coal in Israel became only one quarter, or only 19 terawatt hour, compared to 34 terawatt hour just 10 years earlier. And of course, since you can see that the demand is growing, you can see that the overall amount that Israel is generating is growing over time. And it has grown significantly for over these 10 years, but the share of natural gas is increasing. So not only the share, but the overall total amount is increasing of the use of natural gas. And this is due to this operational use of Tamar reservoir and then the additional use of Leviathan reservoir. You see that in the future, Israel is hoping, or the policy is not to use coal at all. So how this is going to be done? We have 10 units of coal power plants, and the policy of Israel is to shut down 4 units. These units will be shut down because they're very, very old. They were built in the 80s, and they will be shut down. And the rest, 6 units of coal power plants, this coal will be converted to the use of natural gas. So the units will remain, and if Israel will have another crisis, we hope not to have a crisis, but if we will have a crisis and we will not be able to use the natural gas, then these 6 units will be able to shift again and burn coal instead of natural gas. But as long as everything is fine and we have a security of supply of natural gas, then these coal units will operate on natural gas. So of course, these units have a very low efficiency because these are steam units. These are not the combined cycle high efficiency units. So they burn a lot of natural gas. They're not very efficient, but at least natural gas has less emissions. And therefore, this will help Israel meet the targets of emission reduction. So by the year 2025, Israel is hoping, the policy is not to use any coal again, and coal will be kept only such as a fuel for the last resort in case we don't have natural gas. In addition, you can also see in this chart the beginning of use of renewables. And these are the green amount in each column, and you can see that is relatively small in the beginning. You will see, I'll soon explain why. But it is expected to grow. So by the year 2025, Israel is hoping to have 20% renewables, mainly solar energy. And by the year 2030, the target is to have 30% renewables, again, mainly solar energy. So the future fuel mix of Israel is 30% renewables and 70% natural gas. And this is a major shift of fuel compared to the beginning of this chart. So we were moving from 60% coal and only 40% natural gas to 70% natural gas and 30% renewables, with no use of coal at all, only for a time as a last resort. So this is the fuel mix change of Israel. An interesting story is that before Israel decided to shut down the coal units and to convert the coal units to the use of natural gas, so Israel decided to implement emission reduction project in the coal power plant. So this is a very expensive project. It cost $3 billion, and it was supposed to reduce the local emissions by this is not a CO2, a carbon capture project. We don't have a carbon capture project, but this is a project that was implemented to reduce the amount of NOx and SOx and small particles, and it cost $3 billion. But at the same year that this project was completed, at the same year, the policy changed and Israel decided not to use coal anymore. So we spent this $3 billion, but we are not going to use coal anymore. So this became redundant and we actually do not need the project. So this is an interesting story of the change of policy over time. Okay, so we discussed the fuel mix, the changing fuel mix of Israel. And of course, part of this policy is to increase the share of renewables in Israel. So if you are coming, I hope COVID will be over and you will be able to visit Israel. And if you will come, you will see that this is a very sunny country. Most of the time, I guess currently in Russia, it's very cold, but in Israel, most of the days, even in the winter, are very sunny. But Israel does not have much wind. So the policy of Israel is that renewables will be based mainly on solar energy, solar photovoltaic power plants. Currently, at the year 2020, Israel had 2,500 megawatt of PV, of photovoltaic. And the future, the plan is that by the year 2030, so 9 years from now, we will have 16,000 megawatt of solar capacity. So the plan is to increase the solar capacity from 2,500 to 16,000, and to do that by only 9 years. And by doing that, the share of renewables in Israel, it will increase from 6%, the 6% that we had in 2020, this will grow to 30% by the year 2030. And it will be based mainly on solar energy. And as I mentioned, we do not have much wind. This is a very interesting new wind project. So we do have some wind project. This is a project of 100 megawatt. And the plan is to have at least 700 megawatt of wind project. But if you compare, it's only 700 megawatt of wind compared to 16,000 megawatt of solar energy. So we are trying to implement a wind project, but Israel is not windy enough, and there is a lot of resistance to building wind farms. So therefore, we do not base our policy on wind farms. So if you may want to know why we don't have this wind farm or this many wind capacity, on the left here, you see the wind map of Israel. You see what is the wind velocity in Israel in several areas. And what you see is that we do have some strong wind, and it is located mainly in the north. This is called the Ramat Golan area, and close.
Nurit, we seem to have lost your microphone. Does anybody else hear Nurit, or is it just me? And we lost Nurit completely. Okay. In the meantime, until hopefully she'll reconnect, do you guys have any, do you guys understand this? Does this talk to you? Is this something that you know from your own countries? Yes, also. You're on mute, Soso. Soso?
It appears we have a bit of a name problem because I'm not Soso, I'm Luca.
Oh,
Hello, everyone.
hi, Luca.
Hey,
yes, it is a name
well,
problem. You know how to change your name?
Yeah, we'll rename it in a moment. Well, we
Okay.
have a very similar situation here. We have an ongoing market reform and some developments in the renewable sector. So this is directly relevant to our actually activities in Georgia too. So it's nice to see that this is a development elsewhere as well.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, Nurit. Welcome back. Unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I am sorry, I lost the connection for a second. Okay, so we were discussing the wind capacity in Israel, and I mentioned first that there is not the wind is not high enough, or the velocity is not very high. The second point is that Israel is on the route of bird migration. Actually, the birds are coming from your area, from Russia and the eastern part of Europe, and it's coming, and the birds are migrating to Africa each winter and back again. And since Israel is on this route, building the wind farms means that the birds might collide with the wind turbines. So a natural organization are resisting the building of the wind farms. And currently the wind farm that did manage to be built, like the one that we've seen before, this one, So they have some kind of agreement to shut down the wind farm on the specific weeks when the birds are migrating in order to avoid the collision with the birds. So there is some wind potential, but it is very, very small, and most of the potential is solar energy. Now, a country that is mainly based on solar, you don't see many countries like that. And this creates several challenges. And what I would like to review now are the challenges of building a policy which is based mainly on solar. Okay, so let's review these challenges. Okay, and then we will review the renewable scheme. So the first one is that if you have seen the maps, Israel is very, very small compared to Russia, for example. So the area of Israel is very, very small, and there is not much space for building all the, for the population growth and all the infrastructure that we would like to have. And therefore, the first challenge is to find enough land, enough space or area to build this power plant, this solar power plant. And as you may know, solar power plants are very land area demanding. So per 1 megawatt, you would need 10 dunams. So what Israel is currently doing is the focus is on dual use of the country, of the land. And here you see 3 examples. So one of them is to cover water reservoirs. Since Israel is also very dry, we have some water reservoirs. And the idea is to cover them with PV plants. And this also helps the reservoir. So this is the first policy. Another policy is to cover the water transmission pipelines and also to cover roads. So you see an example for that. And the third on them, I think the most interesting part is aggrovoltaic. The idea here is areas which are dedicated to agriculture is to cover them like a rooftop with PV. And the idea is that the PV will also help the agriculture because it affects there is more shade and the humidity might be changing due to this PV installation. And of course, we will be able to use to radiation also for the PV. So these are types of dual use, which Israel is promoting in order to overcome this challenge of the lack of available land for solar PV. Another challenge, which you may see in other countries, it's a famous challenge of California, for example, it's called the Dac Curve. It means that if you have a country which is mainly based on solar PV, that at noon, Israel is going to have excess generation because at noon the demand is being supplied mainly by the PV. PV is generating when the sun is shining, so it happens mainly at noon. But in the evening and in the early morning, there is of course no sunshine, so the demand is growing. So over time, you see like a shape of a duck that in the evening there is a peak demand which is constantly growing, and at noon there is an excess generation. And from noon to the evening, there is it's called the ramp rate, or the changing of the load is changing very rapidly, as you can see in the yellow line. And this is a challenge for the system operation because the system operator, he needs to replace the PV with other generation, mainly natural gas generation. And he needs to do that very rapidly each afternoon. So each day the sun is setting and he needs to increase the load of natural gas to replace the PV. And this is a main challenge. You can see here how this challenge is developing over time. So each of these charts is the average demand of Israel. And you can see each line is a month. It's January, February. I'm sorry, it's in Hebrew, okay? So you may not be able to read that. So you see each line is a month and each column is an hour of the day. And you see the yellow areas, these are the peak demands. And you see this pink area, this is excess generation. So you see that now we do not have excess generation. It is starting to develop in the next few years. But if we go to the end of this decade, to 2030, you will see a lot of excess generation during the winter time and during the spring and the fall time. Because at these months, there is not much demand for electricity because the temperature are very nice outside. But there is a lot of renewable generation. So we are expecting to have these red areas or this excess generation during most of the months of the year. So this is the second challenge of having a lot of solar energy. And the expectation is that we will need storage to solve these problems. And the expectation is for at least a 3.5 gigawatt of storage that will be needed to capture this excess generation and continue the PV generation. The third challenge of Israel is the challenge of the grid. So if you again look at the map of Israel, you will see that most of the population of Israel is living in the central part of Israel. So in this map, when the darker color means that there is a higher population density. So you will see that most of the people live in the areas of Jerusalem, which is the capital of Israel, or Tel Aviv area by the shore here, and some people live in Haifa in the south, but most are in this narrow area of the central part of Israel. And then there is a larger area in the north and in the south of Israel, and these are the areas where most of the PV plants are being built. So the PV plants are not located in the areas where the population live. And this is because the PV plants needs a lot of area, and where the population live, there is not much available land. So therefore, we find the PV plants far away from the location of the population, and then we need transmission lines to connect the PV plants to the population concentration areas. But then building transmission lines in a country which is very small and with a high density, this is a high challenge of Israel. What you see here, these are settlements of Bedouin people. I don't know if you have Bedouins in Israel. They are located mainly in the desert, and they are located mainly in the areas where Israel intended to build the transmission lines. And this created a high challenge for connecting the PV power plants. What you see here is the congestion of the grid due to building lots of PV power plants. So you see in the green line, this is the capacity of the grid. And then in the green area below, you see the generation of the PV plants over time, where the generation begins in the morning when the sun is rising, it gets to the peak in the midday, and then it is declining over time in the evening. And if we add additional capacity, then we get a grid congestion. It means that if Israel wants to build more power plants in the same desert in the south or in the northern part of Israel, the grid would not be able to absorb this energy because there is a grid congestion, because the sun is shining over Israel at the same hours because Israel is so small. And then you get more and more energy generated at noon, and you get excess generation, which is create a congestion of the grid. So this is a major problem now. And the solution for that is also to have storage. So currently in Israel, the policy is that each of these large power plant, PV power plant, will contain also storage. By building the storage, then we eliminate some of the generation at noon. You can see here that at noon there is a high generation. You see this orange line, but we send to the grid, we charge the energy to the grid only to some of the capacity. This is the blue line, and the rest of the generation is being stored. It is charged to storage. And then in the evening, we discharge the energy. The energy is being discharged in the evening, and therefore, instead of sending the energy according to the orange line, the energy is generated according to the blue line due to the storage. So the storage is actually flattening the generation curve of the PV, of the photovoltaic. And this is one way to solve several problems. First, it is decreasing the problem of excess generation at noon because we have less generation at noon. And in addition, it is solving some of the problem of the grid, because if you have storage, then less energy is being sent to the grid at the same time. And as a result, there is less a problem of grid congestion, okay? So by using storage, Israel intends to solve the excess generation and to solve this grid congestion. And now we get to the final part of this short presentation, and this is the emission reduction of Israel. So I mentioned, if you remember in the beginning, that the target of Israel is to reduce the emission by 27% compared to the emission of 2016. By 2030, we are supposed to decrease the emission by 27%. So of course, electricity is not the sole source of emissions. There is also buildings, the heating of buildings, and there is transportation, which is a very high supplier of emission, a high source of emission. But here we focus mainly on the emission that comes from the electricity sector. So this is an interesting graph which shows what happened to the local pollution emission in Israel. So what you see in the line, the top line, is the growing demand or the growing generation of electricity in Israel. So as we explained in the beginning, the demand in Israel is growing over time, and therefore we are generating more and more electricity over the years. So of course, this line is rising. We are generating an increasing amount of electricity over the years. But what you see below in the columns is the pollution emission of Israel, and you see that this is declining. And why is it declining? Even though we generate more and more electricity, it is declining because of the changing fuel mix of Israel. So if you remember, I explained that Israel used in the beginning of this decade, we generated most of the electricity from coal, and this was a very dirty coal. And over time, we implemented these emission reduction elements in the coal power plant. And mainly, we decided to decrease significantly the use of coal and to shift from coal to natural gas and renewables. And what you see here is the result of this policy. You see that the pollution emissions in Israel are declining very rapidly, and there is a significant decline, even though the overall generation is increasing over time. And this is, of course, a much cleaner air for people who live in Israel. The second part is the CO2 emission of Israel, and that comes from electricity generation. And again, in the line, you see that the overall generation of Israel is increasing over time. Currently, we have 72.8 terawatt hour, and at the middle of this decade, at 2025, we expect to generate 81 terawatt hour per year. But you see that the emission of CO2 is declining over time. And this is mainly due to the result of shifting from coal to natural gas, because the CO2, the carbon emission of natural gas, is 50% compared to the emission of coal. And therefore, this shift from coal to natural gas is providing this emission reduction. And it is expected to increase in the future because Israel is shutting down, as I mentioned, 4 units of coal unit, and we are shifting the rest of the coal unit from coal to natural gas. And we are increasing the share of renewables from only 6% to 30%. So all these policy changing are expected to increase the carbon emissions of Israel significantly, as you see in this chart. And this will help Israel meet the targets of emission reduction by the year 2030. To meet the target of 2050 in a country with a growing population and a growing demand, this is very challenging. And Israel still needs to find its policy how to meet this higher target of 85% emission reduction. So I think that this covers all the points that I wanted to cover today. And I'm really happy to answer your questions if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Anything? Yes, Luca. Reminding you all to present your country as well when you ask a question.
Yes, I'm Luca Garibashvili from Georgia. I have a question regarding balancing. You mentioned that the share of PVs is growing rapidly in Israel, and we have a problem with balancing, so we can't really implement new variable renewable energy projects in Georgia. How has Israel mitigated this problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So of course, such a fuel as renewable is creating instability of the grid. And the point in Israel is to have storage, battery storage mainly. So currently, most of the new power plants, the new PV power plants are being built with an integrated storage in them. And this is the policy. And in the future, Israel is going to have additional storage, which is outside of the PV power plant. And they will be controlled by the system operator and by the distribution grid operator in each area. And we are going to have auctions for building this storage. And this is a very big issue currently in Israel. Most of the companies are really rushing to build this storage plant. Currently, we have a very tiny amount of storage. We have two pump storage power plant. The overall capacity currently is 300 megawatt, and we are building additional. We will have 800 megawatt of pump storage. But we will have several gigawatt of battery storage in the future, and this can be built relatively quickly because building battery storage can be done in several months or so.
Thank you.
I'll add something about the storage. Tomorrow you'll be hearing a bit more about storage as well when you hear about the renewable energy's role in the transition to zero carbon electricity sectors by Josef Kedar. So he'll be explaining a bit more about storage as well.
Thank you once again.
Anybody else have questions or comments from your own countries? Yes, Gordana.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I just want to ask what kind of storage do you use in Israel, but you say we will tomorrow know more about it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of battery storage?
Oh, lithium-ion batteries, mainly.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Currently, there are just two small storage installation in Israel. Like a 2 megawatt hour each one of them, but these are just trials and first implementation. And there is also, I'm not sure if this will be discussed tomorrow. Israel has several startups with new technologies of storage, like condensed air storage. This is one technology, and maybe you will see this in the next lectures. And Chakratech, I'm not sure how to describe this in Israel in English. There are several other type of technologies for storage. So currently the main policy is to have 800 megawatt of pump storage, and the rest is mainly going to be batteries. And in addition, in the future, we might have these new technologies too, but they're just emerging now.
Thank you.
Yes, Magdalena.
Hello, this is Magdalena from North Macedonia. Could you please give us more information about the support measures, feed-in tariffs and auctions that you have mentioned?
Yes, I actually skipped this slide, so I'll go back to that. That's a good question. Okay, so I think like other countries, Israel started with feed-in tariffs, and in the beginning, I'm just looking for this slide, and in the beginning, the tariffs were set by the electricity authority, by the regulator. I was part of the regulator, as I mentioned, and we were using Bloomberg to understand the prices. Okay, now we have the slide. And we were setting the tariffs as regulators. And this created a lot of tension because as in the market, because as you may know, the prices were dropping over time, the prices of PV. And as regulators, we were unable to keep the pace of the tariff decline. We were always setting tariffs which were very high, and the entrepreneur in the market, they always demanded to keep the high tariff even though the costs were declining. And so we went to court and we had lots of issues related to that. And since 2018, Israel decided that the regulated tariff will only be available for very small power plants, only for rooftops, currently only for rooftops which are smaller than 630 kilowatt. And if people are building larger power plants, larger PV plants, then Israel has auctions. And there are several types of auctions. One large auction, for example, yesterday they published the result for a very large state-owned land auction, 300 megawatt PV with storage. So this is a state-owned land, and the rest of the PV plants are built on private lands, and they participate in auctions, and these are very, very simple auctions. And these auctions, they just offer the amount that they want, the overall capacity that they wish to build, and they do not have to say where they are going to build that. They can build any size and in any area, of course, if they get the building permits. And in the auction, they offer the capacity that they wish to build and the price that they ask for the feed-in tariff. And then in the auction, the regulator is taking all the prices and choosing, and they are setting a clearing price for all the projects. And of course, they're choosing the price which is supposed to be the cheapest price for the feed-in tariff. So the feed-in tariff for larger project is no longer set by the regulator, but it is set by auctions, where the regulator is just creating these auctions. And this created a very rapid decline of the feed-in tariff. These are very, very successful auctions. In addition to that, there is currently an idea of a new regulation. It was not set yet, it is not working yet, but this is the future plan. And the idea here is to have bilateral contracts. Currently, if you build a PV plant in Israel, you are not able to sell your electricity to someone else. You cannot build a PV plant in one area and consume the electricity in another area and have a bilateral contract between the PV plant and the consumer. But in the future, the idea is that this will be able to be done, and suppliers will be able to purchase the electricity from the PV power plant. The structure of the tariff in Israel, the retail tariff, is currently changing. We used to have at noon the peak demand, and then the peak tariff was at noon. The time of use was higher at noon. But since we're going to have lots of solar energy, then the peak demand and the peak tariff will be shifting to the evening. And the idea is that if a PV plant has a storage, they can sell the electricity at the price which is equivalent to the time of use tariff. And this is going to be to create a high incentive for building PV plant with storage, because the energy can be sold in the evening for a very high price, because the retail tariff is very high in the evening. And the regulator is promoting this regulation because the price in the auction has declined too rapidly. In the auction, the prices are very, very low, and companies are complaining that this is too low to build. Even though they offer the tariff in the auction, they say that the price is too low and then they cannot build the power plants. So the idea is that in this new regulation, with the bilateral contracts, the price will be a little higher, and there will be a high incentive to include storage in the plan and sell the energy to supplier. So I hope this answered your questions.
Yes, thank you. And now these power plants that have been on an auction, to whom they are selling their electricity now? If the new regulation is to choose their supplier.
Yeah. So currently, if you participate in an auction, all the electricity is being sold to the system operator or to the distributor. And then the consumers are buying their energy from the distributor, which is in most cases also the supplier, okay? So it's like a central entity, a single purchaser, we would say, that buys all the renewable energy. And then the consumers are buying their electricity from this entity, from this IEC, the Electricity Corporation. So for example, I'm at home as a residential consumer, I buy my electricity from my distributor. He is distributing electricity and he's also my supplier. And since he is buying all the renewable energy, I buy my renewable energy from him. But in the future, there will be an option for bilateral contract by me and my supplier will be able to purchase this energy in a bilateral contract directly from the PV power plant. But currently, it is not working yet. It will be in the next few years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nurit. We have time for one last question. Tamara, yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Tamara. I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was thinking, did you have, since the PVs play important role in your energy mix, did you have conflicts, let's say, with NGOs from environmental protection scope of work? Because Here in our country, most of renewables come from hydro, and we have those kind of issues with in the ones protecting environment.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, of course. I mentioned earlier with the wind, so there is a high resistance to the wind farms, and this is why one of the reasons we don't have many wind farms. These are resistant, which is related to the birds and the anxiety that the wind might harm the birds. So this is one issue. And with solar, the main issue is the use of open land. In Israel is so small, and there is not many open land that can be used for other uses. So these environmental groups, they resist the use of land for PV. But this was solved by this dual use. Currently, this is the main policy of Israel, is to focus on dual use. Build the PV on rooftops, cover water reservoir, cover everything actually. Even in Israel, you can now cover cemeteries or basketball grounds, or anything can be covered with PV. And the policy is not to use the open available land and use this dual use PV plants. And this is solving the resistance of these environmental groups, because they wanted to keep the land open for other users, and it will be open because we will have dual use for the PV.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Nurit. Thank you everybody for your questions also. Our next presentation lecture is going to be with Josef Abramowitz. Yossi is here.
I'm leaving you, and thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Nurit.
Bye.
Bye.
So Yossi, you're on mute. Will you present yourself, and you can share your screen?
Okay. Do people need a 2-minute break? I mean, Zoom after Zoom after Zoom, or is that people need to stretch?
I think we're okay. It's altogether 2 hours. I think it's okay.
Okay. So before I do the screen share, oops, hold on. All right. Maybe what you'll do is you'll start the video in the meantime. Oops.
Okay, I'm getting the video now.
That will be the best introduction.
Okay.
But actually, you know, since you just heard Nurit, after the video, I'm going to ask you what 2, 3, 4 questions are still most important for you in your roles to be able to succeed. I have a presentation, but I'd rather be as relevant as possible. So after the video, I'm going to ask for whatever questions you have on the solar space, and in the course of my presentation, I'll make sure to answer it. But normally we would wake you up early in the morning, pre-COVID, of course. We would take you in the dark out into the desert, and we'd watch the sunrise over a 40 megawatt solar field that everyone said was going to be impossible to do, that powers a third of our vacation city, Eilat. And there, just in the walk, the questions come out naturally, and the discussion. So we're in an age of COVID and Zoom, and so I apologize. It's just going to be virtual, but you'll see the video so you get a little bit of a feel. And then I'll take some of your unanswered, most pressing questions, and we'll have a discussion. Okay.
Okay. And after the video, whoever is able to turn on your camera, we would definitely appreciate that you do that as well. Let's start this video. Oh, I accidentally, here, hold on a second. I'll be able to start it in a moment. Okay.
And in the meantime, if you have a key question, put it in the chat. Like, we don't have to, I know there's language issues and things like that. So just, you know, what would help you most to succeed? And I'm going to have answers that are a little bit different than Nurit, who is one of the smartest people I know, but she comes from the point of view of the regulator. And I can tell you what it looks like from an investor, an entrepreneur, and NGO perspective.
Okay, I'm starting the video now.
Today I'm proud to announce that Israel is coming back to Africa in a big way.
Power Africa, a strong and prosperous and self-reliant Africa.
From this mountaintop, we call on the United Nations to affirm that access to green power and affordable green power should be elevated as a fundamental human right for all of humanity and for all people.
I want to say thank you to Goza Shalom Youth Village for being our partners.
warwanye mbere nirwo rwari rukomeye bityo ntago numva impamvu rari rwo rukunaniye sigaho kumanika amaboko niharagera abawe tukuri inyuma witeka kikurora wakoze biriya n'ibindi azabikora ninyakuremeye kuruha ntutinye umubabaro uzagera ushire tugacinye never give up my friend you got me ihorere uri wenyine hari n'abakomerewe ndetse no kukurusha.
We commit to invest $2 billion into Africa.
Israel is coming back to Africa. Africa is coming back to Israel.
Okay, so I know none of you come from Africa, but don't worry because I have been to Dushanbe and so I understand we have a friend from Tajikistan here. So just for your thrill and pleasure, let's see if I can get this up. Can you see my screen?
Nope. And also
No.
the Tajikistani participant isn't actually here today. But
Oh, so this is me signing the first solar deal in Dushanbe in Tajikistan, but you can tell them. And similarly, you can't see the screen?
Nope.
Let's, hold on.
Oh, there we go.
No, that might be the wrong screen now. Do you,
Oh.
do you see the president of Albania?
Yes.
No. Oh, you do? So
Yes.
this is in the presidential palace lighting the Hanukkah candles. A good number of years ago in Albania, trying to do the first solar deal there. And a bunch of other places. So, and here's with the Prime Minister of Albania as well. Now, share. So friends, I'll tell you, hold on, I hear background noise. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey and then what I can kind of help you think through. We're at an incredible inflection point as a species, as humanity. And the fact that you've gathered with the UN through the Arab Institute and our foreign ministry is such a blessing because there's no way to make the kind of shift in power and emissions without people like you, in each and every one of our countries. My own story is that I moved from Israel to Avigail's home community in the southern desert about 15 years and 4 months ago. And it was really hot and sunny. And that's it. We're talking desert here. Syria's third most extreme desert in the world. And there wasn't a single kilowatt connected to the grid of solar energy. We have hot water heaters. We're, I think the world leaders in that. But, and our regulator, and I have to say, some of you work in government offices, our regulator was against, partly out of ignorance, partly out of we had very cheap coal, right? Nobody was talking about the climate in a serious way then. there was air pollution that was literally in the air, right? But there wasn't enough forces driving the switch to renewables. And the vision we had in the south of Israel is that, you know, given the climate issues, and again, it's only accelerated since then, wouldn't it be amazing if we can take a whole region of our country, and for us that meant from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea, sort of this southern strip of extreme desert, 111 miles long, including communities, factories, a lot of hotels. And let's be the first region in the world that will hit 100% daytime solar. And not that it would change the whole world, and it would just take care of some of our emissions, but it would be the proof of concept so that Israel should be 100% daytime solar, but that to de-risk and to learn what we need to learn so that every single country on the planet, before we get to the storage technologies you began asking questions about, could do that. And every government office and every energy expert told us it's going to be impossible. And so I say to you as either entrepreneurs or experts or regulators or people in government offices, that I understand the inclination to say, okay, we can do 10, 20%. That's within reason. But I want to see you on and raise you all the way up to the 100% quickly. And we'll talk about grid stability, and we'll talk about other kinds of renewable. We're just starting now mini hydro and wind as well, and storage. But what often happens is that you have the NGO sector doing the dreaming because of climate, and then you have the government saying no, and the investors are not interested because there's no horizon, there's no certainties. Investors only want to come in if there's horizon and certainty and opportunity. And part of my challenge to you is, how do you, particularly those of you in government or those of you who have impact on government, how do you come up with the right framework to be able to incentivize people like me, but people around the world, to say, you know what, here's a country I haven't thought about, North Macedonia, right? What is it that will give me certainty to invest money so that they can get the benefit of clean power, particularly without the emissions? And what I have found, and I've done this now in working in different 20 countries or so around the world and advising many others, is that each regulator looks at what a different country did. And you know, Nurit was quoting some very low prices today, and so that you're hearing those prices and you're thinking that's how you begin. And it's not the way to do it. The way to do it is actually, you want to start relatively high because you want to get your first major program off the ground. You want people to succeed. Yeah, it means you're going to have to pay a little bit more, but that's what we did in Israel. And then after the first, in our case, 300 megawatts, they switched to tenders, which for a while slowed down the market. But I can just say that, you know, your countries, believe it or not, you have enough sun so that a significant portion of your energy can come from the sun. And again, some of your countries I know well, and you're going to ask me about clouds and rainy seasons and things like that, and we'll go through that. But I want to tell you that we now need to all double and triple our goals, and we're proof positive that we can do that. And as you saw from the video, I took our success in Israel because we are the first region to hit 100% daytime solar by 2020. We're proud to say. And it was sort of despite the government, not because of it. Doesn't mean there aren't good people there, but we could have done it in 3 to 5 years instead of 13, 14 years. And again, as some of you who are in key positions, I want to encourage you to make the enabling environment for your first 10, 20, 30% of solar. Yeah, it has to be worthwhile for investors because they're taking a lot of risk, but then you succeeded for your for your country, and the prices will come down for your future fields. At this point, maybe whether it's in the chat or Abigail, however, to kind of get some questions, I have a presentation, and it's basically what I do in places like Africa. And it's very similar from market to market. Some of you may have more experience with NGOs and private sector, some less, but I want to be as relevant as possible. So maybe there's 4 or 5 questions that are most burning when it comes to the question of solar energy that people can put out there. And that way, when I'm kind of going through, basic PowerPoint, I'll make sure that it really is relevant to you all.
Okay, does anybody have any questions about solar energy, about how to get solar energy out there to the people? If you think of a question, you can ask now, or you can also put it in the chat.
In large percentages. I don't want to hear 10, 20% anymore.
Yes, Oleg.
Hey, Oleg.
Thank you. Yeah, I still have to unmute myself, turn the camera on, the whole story. And let me put the hand down. The question is, which you might have heard with the previous speaker and the questions that were asked. Increasing the share of variable renewables presents a problem if they are connected to the grid balancing. Well, everybody knows the story. One of the options which the previous lecturer mentioned is battery storage, which is one of the possible electricity storage options. Are other options also being considered? I'm asking that because I was just 2 weeks ago in Uzbekistan, and their plans are actually impressive. They want in the next 4 to 5 years to add 3 gigawatt of wind and 5 to 8 gigawatt of solar. But their grid is completely unprepared for that. Right. So they do want to study and explore possibilities of storage, various types of storage. What can you tell? What is your opinion? Let me put it this way. Battery storage only or other possibilities? They are, for example, Uzbekistan, they are considering hydrogen very seriously. Thank you.
Okay, no, great and timely question. And I'll give you some answers that you expect and some answers you don't expect. Yes, anybody else? Okay, because again, I don't know what it's like to sit so far away for so many hours on a presentation, but I'll, can you see that screen?
No, we can't see your screen.
Not yet.
Hold on, let me try one more time.
Nope.
No.
Do you want me to share the presentation?
Yeah, I had the new one, but yeah, why don't you? Yeah,
I
had a
was
new
going
one,
to say,
but
I hope that you would have a new one because this one is 3 years old. But
I know, I do have a new one, but you go for it because it's really just meant to spark more of the questions rather than this is how you do it.
No problem.
So look, Oleg, I'll start with your question, and thank you for the question. Look, what I find missing from the Uzbekistan plan is a couple of things. One is, I know everyone's looking at large-scale grid storage and pump storage and those kinds of things, and the answer is yes, yes, and yes. But I also want to encourage institution and home storage. Like start at the smallest level along the way, because it brings grid stability much faster. You have to incentivize that, of course. You have to mandate, you have to incentivize it. But the other key, and we're finding this more and more is going to be the truth in Africa, is regional integration. Now, I know Uzbekistan doesn't always get along with Tajikistan and this, and they're fighting over the hydro, and then in the winter it freezes over and all those different pieces there. But regional integration is the way to go. And so part of the issues that come up on regional issues are losses along the grid. And so again, I don't know the topography that well. I know it's a lot of mountains and a lot of issues, But I would encourage, if you're looking at a large regional, I'm not talking about the Serbia, those kinds of, you're relatively close to each other, but the former Soviet republics, you should consider a high voltage DC grid to be able to share the power. You don't have any losses on it. It is a multi-stakeholder project. I'm pretty sure the Asian Development Bank and others would help, with that. And so I'd encourage that the feasibility studies and the planning will have that, and that will help you across the region to be able to balance things. And I think that will be one of the real drivers of renewables, once you know that you could also export, which also means that when you have a deficit, you can import. And so the more we're interdependent along a broader range of inputs of energy, wind, hydro, I don't know if you need hydrogen out there, but it's a lot of the gas companies are promoting hydrogen because they want their pipelines to get built and say, yeah, and in the future it'll carry hydrogen. But I'm only a fan of green hydrogen, meaning just use renewable energy to split the hydrogen and the oxygen. I don't want to hear about ammonia. I don't want to hear about methane. I don't want to hear about all the tricks of the fossil fuel industry to be able to promote hydrogen as a clean fuel. So if you have a climate agenda, and I assume that's one of the things on the table, is beware of non-green hydrogen and all the costs and the tricks of the trade to just keep you burning methane on that. So a long answer, but regional integration, certainly, between Italy and Albania and North Macedonia and like those kinds of places, you already have a fair amount of that, right? And so the more that you can do the integration, the less shy you need to be, or cautious you need to be about your renewable goals, particularly when it comes to solar. So let's go to the basic presentation.
Okay, let me know if you can see the correct screen when I share.
Thank you, Yosef. Just a small comment. Uzbekistan, at least as they say it, they do want green hydrogen. They have, as you know well, a lot of natural gas.
Yes.
And they seem to say, no, hydrogen, we want green, we want from the renewables. That's why with the amount of renewables they are planning, they see hydrogen as one of the options what the renewables could be used for. Again, one thing is the plans and the other thing is their implementation. So we have to see, but UNEC, which I and Gianluca and I represent, we are ready to help. We might need, help from other places. So we're going to stay in touch with you. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Stasiva. Okay, so we'll just do a little bit of presentation, but it's more again to spark your questions. So this is the first field we built in Africa. This is in Rwanda. This field supplies 6% of the country's power. Actually, you can see it on the, it's in the shape of Africa, if you see my the screen behind me. And that came about because I built for Avigal's community 2 fields. The first one in the Middle East, 4.9 mega, and then the massive 40 megawatt one across the street that you saw in the opening of the video. Go ahead, you can click through. Right, so actually back when, this is interesting, the John Kerry quote, just to understand. It used to be, there was this conception of, if you want economic growth, go with hydrocarbons. And this is already back when Kerry was Secretary of State, not in his current role. And this is back in Paris. I had the privilege to be on the Israeli negotiating team. And I am just back now from Glasgow. And so even then, when people were talking about energy, they were talking billions. And even here was the first hint of that it's multi-trillions. At this point, out of Glasgow, people are talking about this green growth is going to be the drivers of so much of the world economy. And so those countries that can embrace it quickly. So your roles in many of your countries is to enable for these trillions essentially to find their way into your countries. And it's not about subsidies anymore, right? Because there are direct costs to solar, and you know them in your power purchase agreements. And then there's certainly the indirect costs of pollution and health and soon carbon taxes, right? That if you don't have them now, they'll be imposed upon you by the EU. So you might as well get ready and initiate them now. So this is about the economic future, not only of the world, but of your countries. And so many of your positions, and I saw your job descriptions, you and your ministers or heads of state haven't thought about it as being so much about economic drivers, but no. The message out of Glasgow is a market signal. It is your opportunity to make your country now attractive for these trillions to start moving in your direction. And that's a big shift that I'm pleased to be able to share with you. Any questions about that? And you can go to the next slide. Okay. Look, I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. We learned the core of the business in Israel, it's all about creating certainty for the investors, a bankable power purchase agreement that we can do the financing on. The financing of the first fields in Israel was 80% debt, 20% equity. I think it's now 90% debt because the market has gotten used to it. The risk profile has gone down, but then we took our know-how and we brought it to the developing world. And I know some of your countries are considered the developing world as well. So what we specifically do, we are Africa-centric, although you saw the picture with the Tajik minister and the Bosnian prime minister. We bring 100% financing. In other words, if you as regulator or energy official or utility can sign a real contract that is recognized in the international market, then groups like us are willing to come with 100% financing. So it's not, the burden isn't on you. A lot of times, and up until now, many of your countries always looked at it as a budgetary item. I mean, it'd be nice if your country paid for the feasibility studies and getting the land ready and your substations, et cetera. That would incentivize more investors to come faster. But the entrepreneurs can come with 100% financing with the bankable documents. Our brand equity is because we built in Israel and we've built in Africa. We did build in Georgia, but don't get so excited because it's, Georgia, USA. We built the 22 megawatt. So sorry about that. Innovation, you saw a little bit in the film. Where it is appropriate, we definitely have great technologies and like the solar powered robots. Like for deserts, it's a big issue, the dust storms. But there are, and Nurit mentioned that, the speaker before, there are innovations coming out on a whole range of aftermarket and on storage, and that's something that we coming out of Israel are able to bring with us. Certainly having a good team that's been through this, and then the documents, and for us, it's the corporate social responsibility. We're always trying to do good while we're doing well, and if you're opening up, RFPs to the market, or opportunities or licenses, I'm much more of a license. I want to encourage you to go with licenses where you set the tariff to jumpstart your industries, but put in that there should be social benefit, working with an educational university to train for green jobs, for example. Those are things that are acceptable. We would like to encourage as part of our Israeli solar vision for the world. Any questions on that one? If not, you can go to the next slide. Thank you, yeah. We're frozen. You can go to the next one. This is just corporate stuff. We've been blessed with a very good team. And this slide is important. These are some of the partners that we bring, and it's not only we, but you may feel alone in your office in whatever city you're in, especially the smaller countries where you have fewer experts to interact with, which is why, Oleg, thank you, for bringing people together, and thank you, Abigail, so that you can have each other. But there are a lot of global partners that want to deploy capital and expertise, and we've certainly tapped in to some of the big ones and the small ones to be able to do what everyone had told us at each step was going to be impossible. So these are some of the brand names that we work with, and some of them I do want to say are grant facilities for those feasibility studies. Again, I want to encourage you to either with your own government budget monies or to tap into whatever development banks or otherwise you have in your regions to be able to put forward those monies on the table so that developers and investors can come in, but you've helped to de-risk it. Next slide. Keep going. Well, this is an old slide because you can see it goes through 2015, but sorry, I couldn't get my new deck working. But as you know, 85% of the growth in energy, and particularly in renewables, is going to come from the developing world. Now, some of you are not officially considered that, but you may have relatively weak or fragile or small economies, and some of you are definitely from the developing world. But that's where the growth is. And so the people who have the money, they know that, but they just don't know how to think about your markets in a way that gives them comfort. So, but that's where the demand is, and anything you can do to give people like us comfort is what will bring those trillions in. Next slide. That's Africa-centric. Keep going. Look, what a developer does, these are the professional steps. Maybe some of you have worked for developers or are trying to invite developers, into your countries, with or without the financing. But these are really the 6 things that we do, and that if you're in a government office, you want to make sure that your developers can do, but you also want to help facilitate to do that. Like land rights in many of your countries are often very, very complicated, right? There are traditional land rights, there are federal, there are state, there are city ones, there's private ones. And so whatever it is that you can do to give visibility or to, pre-find sites, obviously better if they're flat, if they're not in a wildlife preserve. You'd be surprised what many government people have sort of allowed to get to a certain stage, and then of course through the due diligence they fall down. So the more that you can at least identify those places, and obviously close to grid or future grid, that is very helpful if you want to encourage the international community to invest. The permitting, there are some countries that have permitting that are just so expensive that it's the way of saying, we don't want you to come into our country. And there are some countries that understand that developers are taking risk, and it takes years often to do this, and we'll have very low fees, but we'll have clearly outlined steps. So the clearer those steps are, the more reasonable the fees are on the permitting will give groups like us confidence to consider investing and working in your country. Now, power purchase agreements. This is the heart of the matter. And we've seen, I would say, most power purchase agreements that come from government to us are not bankable. And I'm not speaking specifically about each of your countries, although some of your countries have seen, let's call it earlier iterations of power purchase agreements. First of all, try to have it extend out to 25 years rather than 20, because the guarantees on the panels now have extended out on the performance of the panels. It's also good for you because you're able to spread the cost per kilowatt hour from 20 years to 25 years, and that can maybe lower your tariff a little bit along the way. And guarantees, and we know some of you may not be able to provide the guarantees, or there's certain conditions you can do it. And there are different levels of guarantees. There are creative groups like ourselves. Some markets we can work in without a full sovereign guarantee, but there are other types of letters of credit and other things. But the more that you can put that forward in advance and think that through and create that package, the faster the investor community will come into your countries. And so, and oftentimes the money will, most of the time, at least for the first fields, the money will come from outside your countries. So to really think about those international guarantees is very, very important. We engage the EPCs, engineering, procurement, construction companies. We bid it out. We bid it out because it's the right thing to do, but we also bid it out because we often get grants. And so there's the international financing community has certain standards about procurement to make sure that we're putting it out to bid and we're listing it on their websites. You're looking for, we want to make sure that a developer is using somebody who has not only a good EPC with experience, but has really the bankability that if something goes wrong, they can pay the liquidated damages, like if the field isn't performing. The financing I already mentioned, and the interconnection, right? The more you could share or absorb the first costs of interconnection for your first fields, the sooner you'll get the investors to be able to really look at your country in a serious way. And again, just as we talked a little bit with Oleg before, some of your countries are very small. The markets are very small. And so it's, you know, you're going to say, well, can you do 5 megawatts to get started? And the answer is it's not usually worth going in. But if you're able to sell into a regional power pole, you know, or do what you heard Nurit talk about, wheeling arrangements from a generator of electricity all the way over to a factory or to a municipality, then you may be able to get more scale. Thank you, Gordana. So when you think about the interconnection, it may not just be the point of interconnection, but also how do you look at your market and look at an expanded sense of market? So it's worth it for us to invest in your country. Avigail? This is important because whether or not there's real risk in your countries, and some more than others there's always perceived risk, right? You know, what good is a 25-year guarantee on a country that's only been around for 25 years, for example, right? So there are these facilities, there are these tools of the international community that we tap into, whether it's through the World Bank, in some of your cases through, I think the European Bank for Investment and Reconstruction, they have it, the Asian Development Bank, US government is one of our partners in this. But there are certain things that you as a country will need to do that will allow us to bring in the multilateral guarantees that tell the investors, you know what, calm down. Whatever you read in the paper that may or may not be true, there may or may not be indicative of the risk, but we, the international community, will have an insurance wrap in this country and in this particular solar deal. And so you, those of you who are in government, you want to look up what do they need to be able to see that from you that there's a serious commitment to be able to help de-risk and that your contracts have a good track record. Any questions about the last couple slides? Because I think I know I've thrown a lot of information at you. You know, if we're in person though, I'd be pulling it out of you, but all right. So we'll keep going. Slide. this is the field in Rwanda. And again, some of you asked about grid stability. And when you're doing 6% of a country's power, you really do have to think about the load balancing and everything. And when the engineers from the local utility were doing the grid survey, they thought that they would have no problem absorbing the power. We sent their engineers actually to Germany for some training, and we insisted on a second grid line to be built to come out to the field. And sure enough, as the field was getting ready to be interconnected, we had, you turn it on in stages, 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt, 3 megawatt, the grid fell. This is in July and August of that year. And then September 1st, the second grid line was able to be attached. And again, we did 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt, we took it all the way up, and it was able to be stable. So training the local engineers, which I know some of you are connected to, and there are international programs to do that, I would call it a prerequisite for doing your grid study and be able to attract developers to come in. Next slide. And by the way, Rwanda, since, even though they've wanted another solar field, the grid hasn't been able to take another solar field precisely for that reason. Nigeria, boy, we've been working a long time on this. This is a big one, over 100 megawatts. It's all the way up north. Its topography is a lot different than your countries. Here is a good example where we had to really train the regulator and the government ministries, and there's still too much uncertainty in the overall electricity market. They haven't solved for the uncertainty, and so we have not yet gone to financial close, even though the money has been lined up. So maybe in some of during the question time, you can see which, I know Turkey's on, and we can talk about the Turkish market. We've tried very hard there, and we ran into a lot of issues there about certainty in contracts. Next slide. This is again more commercial than what we were looking at the time. I think with that, Abigail, we can bring it back to the group. It can be questions about what we put on the table, just to kind of spark your interest. But we do have we've seen a lot of obstacles, and we hope that when you come out with your graduation certificate from this course, this Mashav course, that you'll be empowered to overcome the obstacles that your current country's markets have. And so any questions you have that our experience can benefit and help you unlock the potential for those trillions. We're here to be, at the very least, good neighbors and thought partners on a world that desperately needs all of us to ramp up renewables. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosef. Does anybody have any questions? And Yosef, do you want to know what countries are representing here today?
Yeah, I have the printout list. So again,
yes, not all of them are here today, though.
Okay.
Davka mentioned Tajikistan and Turkey. Neither of them are here today.
Yeah,
we do have other countries.
Luca from Georgia, I'd love to
yes.
hear. And what's the central challenge holding you back?
Well, we have a single project at the moment. We have a 5 megawatt power plant, solar one in Udabno, but it has been in development for the past, 5 years maybe. So it's not really moving forward. We have made some steps now, but it's not looking very optimistic at the moment.
Oh no! Well, but how come? I can tell you, to build a 5 megawatt now takes 3 to 4 months. So what's holding back the question of the certainty?
I don't really know, but I suppose it is more related to market uncertainty. We are in the middle of a reform, so perhaps some investors are hesitant to enter our markets.
Right. Did you do it as a bid, or did you do it as you said, we're open to grant a license to someone who comes with the qualifications?
I believe Georgia did it with a bid.
Now, so the international community has steered you wrong. And I know that's what they want, but no, just say, you know, it's, I don't know, 14 cents or whatever you know, you need a good IRR, work backwards. What's the investor return? Make sure they have a 15 to 20% IRR in the first fields and figure out how many sunlight hours you have, which aren't necessarily that many. And then you'll come out with a tariff. If you would have said, here's the tariff, 15.5 cents for 25 years linked to inflation, first come, first serve, or, you know, show us your qualifications and we'll choose the best one, that field would have been built 5 years ago or next year, right? And so I don't know what your position is, Luca, there, but just reboot it and give certainty to investors and people will fight to just complete it. But you shouldn't start a market, I believe, with a bid on such a small project where no one's really going to make enough money to justify the time and the risk. Because that's where our regulator has gotten this wrong. They always look, she told you, we look at Bloomberg to figure out what the price is. Yeah, well, the price of the panels is on Bloomberg, but the second highest line item cost in the financial model, which they never recognize, are the years and years and years of delays because of them, all right? Because of the uncertainty. Someone has to pay for that, right? And so that's the wrong way to do it. So if you have any input into your system on the reformation, just give a 15 to 20% IRR in your first 5 fields, say what the price is, and let people compete for your affections and the deals. Hope that's helpful, Luca.
Yeah, thank you. I also have a second question related to storage, actually. Yep. We had some discussions about not really commercial solar power plants, but residential ones. Some experts in our country have proposed that we install a small community storage battery in a neighborhood. How viable would this be in the long term for us?
Yeah, I'm a big believer on that. Like, you know, we're in the Middle East. We have 150,000 missiles aimed at us. So from our point of view, maybe a little bit different than yours, right? Is that, you know, every community center, every hospital, every school, I think should have both solar panels as well as storage, and you can have it also on a mini grid basis to kind of even sell back if you have extra and quiet. But yeah, no, I think we all have to do this. You want to balance between a distributed network day and night and the grid. But what if the grid falls, right? What if Putin wakes up one day and decides he just wants to hack your system, right? And to pressure you to change your vote at the UN or not join, I don't know, whatever, NATO or something or whatever it is. And so you're very vulnerable. So definitely, yes. And it's cost effective basically now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
I mean, what's stopping you from going 100%? Really? What's really stopping you in your country? At least during the day. That's the challenge of the Israeli vision, at least the Arava vision.
Anybody? Not
Well,
everybody
look,
at once.
I'm gonna just assume that they're all committed to the 100% renewable and 50% by 2030, and they don't need any help. And if they got it, then great. Let's just mutually reinforce each other on this road to decarbonization. Hopefully, very quick decarbonization. But if there are any questions in this forum, I'm happy to try to be helpful. And also, Abigail knows how to reach me if there are any follow-up matters.
Of course. Okay, if there are no more questions, and Yossi, do you have anything else that you want to add?
Just where, it's just the coming out of Glasgow, the feeling that the whole world has to do this massive shift. And there's people out there talking about money and very big dreams and whatever, but it's you and it's me and it's Abigail, and every country has to figure this out, and not like tomorrow. They have to figure it out today. So we're very pleased to be, a small part of your program. We did dream big when everyone told us it was impossible. And like, thank God we accomplished a world record setting goal, certainly where Abigail lives. And I know it's not easy. By the way, I don't mean to minimize, oh yeah, just switch it over. We know it's difficult, but you're in the hot seat, but you're also in the hero seat. And be a climate hero, and we're here to support you.
Thank you very much. Those are great words to end this session with. And I will upload the video to the Google Drive if and when I can, and it doesn't take 5.5 years to do. And the presentation as well. So if you do have an updated presentation, please send it to me. So I'll upload the updated one.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow morning or afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello.